film Hemp for Victory was made in the 1940s, was commonly distributed all over the country.
Long ago, when these ancient Grecian temples were new, hemp was already old in the service of mankind.
The Defense Department urged and had farmers growing hemp for rope and for other marine uses during the Second World War.
We're in the middle of a war effort. We need to make rope, we need to make sails, we need to make the things that hemp is great for making.
The Conestoga wagons and prairie schooners of pioneer days were covered with hempen canvas. Indeed, the very word canvas comes from the Arabic word for hemp.
The only thing that you see in that whole movie about marijuana is that you need to buy this special permit. Be careful how you use the seed. You have to buy this permit, the marijuana tax stamp.
For to grow hemp legally, you must have a federal registration and tax stamp. This is provided for in your contract. Ask your AAA committeeman or your county agent about it. Don't forget,
Chicago lawmen seize a 4-acre field of marijuana. Retail value, $4 million. And they face the problem of disposing of the illicit crop before it goes to seed. Sheriff Lohman's answer, call in the Marines. Marijuana is a weed and spreads like crabgrass once it goes to seed. But 3 Marines armed with flamethrowers live up to the Corps' boast. They have the situation well in hand.
In 1969, Timothy Leary fought a case to the Supreme Court.
It was fairly early in Timothy's career, but it was after he was well known because he'd gotten kicked out of Harvard. And he and his wife, Rosemary, and their daughter, Susan, crossed the border. And first of all, they were stopped on the United States side. And they found out who he was. They ran all this check on him in Washington and so forth. And they told him to go ahead, cross the border. But meanwhile, the customs authorities had called the Mexican border police on the other side and told them to refuse Tim Leary on their side. That he was Tim Leary, this terrible, awful proselytizer for acid, right? And that they were going to get him when he came back. So they turned him back at the Mexican side of the border. He turned the car around. According to him, he told me this story himself. Turned the car around and told anybody in the car, if anybody has any grass on them, get rid of it, pitch it over. They came back across the American side. They stopped him and said, "You're coming in now from Mexico. We get to search your entire car." And strip searched everybody. Lo and behold, found the 2 joints in Susan's panties. Timothy, bless his heart, trying to protect Susan, said, "They're mine. I asked her to carry them for me," which is a lie. He didn't even know they were there. So they busted him for international drug smuggling, for bringing 2 joints across, where they'd forced him to come back across by not allowing him to go to Mexico. Timothy fought that case all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Well, what they did then is they set $100 per ounce tax on marijuana, and of course $100 in 1937 was quite different from $100 in 1967. And so basically, though, that they weren't issuing any of the licenses, they weren't issuing the permits. He challenged that there wasn't really a tax at all, that in fact it was a prohibition, and the prohibition is unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court agreed, and it ruled in favor of Timothy Leary, and it overturned the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. So this created a crisis in the federal government, because actually, use of marijuana was never illegal. It was always a possession of marijuana without a tax permit that was illegal up to that point. And so once that was overturned, they had to do one of 2 things. Either they have to actually start charging people $100 an ounce tax and letting them have it, or they had to come up with Plan B. So they came up with Plan B. Plan B was to create the Controlled Substances Act, in which they set up these 5 schedules to control drugs. And that would include marijuana and all sorts of drugs. And so it goes all the way to the 5 schedules, and then what we call Schedule 6, which is unscheduled, really. And then you have Schedule 1, which is that Congress did 2 things. The first thing they did is they said that in order for a drug to fit into Schedule 1, it has to do the following. It has to have no medical value, no accepted medical use, and a high potential for abuse. The second thing they did was they said, well, we don't know about marijuana, so we're going to stick it in there. That became a very critical thing, because as I mentioned, the Marijuana Tax Act had just been overthrown, And so now they had stuck it in there, and they're saying, well, it wasn't really prohibited, it was just being regulated, and it was in there only temporarily while they do the research on it.
A young freshman congressman named Ed Koch, who later became mayor of New York, proposed the idea that we need a commission to investigate marijuana.
Nixon has decided he's willing to consider some new data on marijuana.
The commission was established by Congress, and literally commissioned by Congress, with the advantage that Dick Nixon got to appoint several members, including the chairman.
Before the report even came out, Nixon said that he was morally opposed to marijuana, and therefore he would not act upon the proposals of the commission if it suggested that marijuana should be decriminalized.
Raymond Schaefer, who was the former Republican governor of Pennsylvania, and who had been fiercely anti-narcotics.
Schaefer himself went into it with the expectation that they were going to find out marijuana was a dangerous drug and had to be banned and da-da-da.
The commission was a setup. The commission was supposed to be a fact-finding commission run by the right wing. You know, it was supposed to find the facts that would prove the government's case that marijuana was terrible.
Well, over the course of the hearings, they found out that was not the case at all.
The recommendation of the Commission in its first report is that we do not feel that private use or private possession in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalization, that people who experiment should not be criminalized for that particular behavior.
And what a surprise, they drew the same conclusions that the LaGuardia Commission had drawn. No links between cannabis and aggression, no serious health consequences, no links to crime, no links to hypersexual or unsafe sexual behavior.
And in fact, they found out that marijuana is less of a problem to society than alcohol and tobacco, and they made a specific point of it, and it wasn't connected to violence, and they said there was no gateway theory. It was, I mean, there was a theory, but there was no substance to the gateway theory.
It was all the same story again. Nixon, again, really flipped.
Nixon was just flabbergasted. They've recorded some conversations in the Oval Office where he's saying, must have been them Jews, them psychiatrists, they're all Jews, you know, on that commission. As it turned out, there was only one Jewish person on that commission, no, maybe two, one of whom was a psychiatrist. And the rest of them were right-wing Republicans who'd been selected to be against marijuana and who'd had their minds changed by the facts, by the truth.
One of the things that happened after the Schaefer Commission was established was that a lawsuit was launched. And actually it came up a few years later when Robert Randall was arrested for marijuana. Robert Randall's a glaucoma patient.
Bob discovered that if you smoked a joint, that the haloing and tunnel vision that you get with severe glaucoma vanished. It opened up his peripheral vision. It stopped making it bright and hazy and fuzzy the way you get with glaucoma. At that point, Bob tried to raise a couple of plants. He was living in Washington by then, Washington, D.C. Tried to grow a couple of plants, went on a vacation, came back and discovered that the plants were gone off his balcony, and a note from the police said, come and talk to us. So the Washington police arrested him for cultivation of marijuana, a federal felony. He was able, with his doctors, his researchers, and his own personal experience, to show with his medical records that his glaucoma had improved since he started using marijuana.
He was able to prove that marijuana was the only thing that could control the glaucoma that was destroying his eyesight.
He won the court case and forced the federal government, as a result of this case, to provide him with marijuana. Since the federal government claimed it was the only legitimate source of marijuana at the old Mississippi pot farm, right, that the federal government had to give him marijuana to avoid losing his eyesight. The IND investigational program then started with Bob Randall. He was the first patient. Elvie Musica also got in there for glaucoma. She has kept herself from going completely blind for more than 20 years.
We tried all kinds of medications, but I really had a horrible time with most of them. Diamox, for instance, made me stay in bed and stare at the ceiling, and that's not all I wanted to see in life. So after 3 days of that, I knew I couldn't take that. The drops, some drops totally shrunk my pupil, and to the point that I woke up in the middle of the night thinking I had gone totally blind without waiting for glaucoma to take its toll. That was very scary. But the pressures were down, and the doctors were happy, but obviously I was not. One doctor was extremely kind and told me that if I didn't start using marijuana, I would go blind. I will eternally be grateful to that doctor, because I really didn't have any clue that there was any medical value to cannabis. I didn't even know the name of the plant. I believed all the horrible stuff that was told about marijuana. I questioned the doctor's sanity, but of course the thought never left my mind because nothing else was working for me, and eventually I did try it, and yeah, it was great. It relieved my pressures noticeably. 12 years after the ordeal had begun with the Bascom Palmer Eye Institute, I was arrested, and I knew that the government had no right to demand blindness out of their citizens, and I really believed that, and I went straight to the public. I didn't even look for an attorney, and I was extremely lucky to have a judge that understood that I was not a criminal, and nor is anyone else in my shoes, and that we were people he did not want to see in his courtroom, that the legislators needed to take responsibility and rewrite the laws because they were not intended for people who have serious problems which are corrected with cannabis. They make me go to Florida to pick up 3, 5, we were going to go for 6 months at a time. Can you imagine getting on an airplane with 5 tins of marijuana, half pound at least each? And you think, well, what do you do? Well, I'm not going to try to hide that. I just put it in my backpack and I walk through it, and if they have a problem, they'll tell me. So far, there has been no problem.
Each one of these cases was decided by a court and not decided by the FDA, much less by the DEA. So the problem is that because a court decided that these were exceptions to the general rule, the government didn't have to admit that marijuana had medical uses. Even though it's blatantly obvious they're sponsoring a program of medical use of marijuana for certain patients. There were about 30 or 40 people who applied, including AIDS patients and cancer patients. What killed the IND program was, in 1990, the 6th International AIDS Conference was held here in San Francisco. AIDS epicenter, San Francisco, where thousands of young men are infected. Bob had started an organization called MARS, something about Medical Marijuana Research Association. I forget what the exact words were. And he set up a little table at the International AIDS Conference, and it happened that the table space that he got, by coincidence, was right by the front door. So when people went into the AIDS conference in San Francisco, the first thing they saw is medical marijuana. Big sign, big, help patients. The result was, within a week after the conference folded in San Francisco, there are 300 new IND applications on the desk in Washington, D.C. of the FDA.
There were at least 300 to 400 applications with documented doctors and everything else laying for approval, and he decided that, actually it was James L. Mason, who at the time was the head of the Human Health Department, decided that if we were given the marijuana to people with AIDS, they would just get promiscuous and go and infect the rest of society. And that was the excuse that stopped the program from being passed on to other patients.
300 new people, and they only had like 15 or 20 in the program? No way, Jose. So in about 1992, I guess it was, 91 or 92, the federal government emitted this statement that marijuana had no medical uses recognized, and they were closing the IND program because people were abusing it. Huh? Once again, politics is blind to medical reality.
But lucky for the 7 of us who are still there, the ones who were in the program were grandfathered in for the rest of our lives.